To define a trend graph component, we need our shape data component, and it will need to be statically set to trending. You also require a parameter shape data in which you can define one or multiple parameters or a trend group. It's separated by a pipe, so you can define multiple parameters and separate them with a pipe character. On the right, you can find a small example. But we can also trick the trend graph into showing an empty trend graph, just like we have in the trending app, for instance. I'll open up a view. There's some presets already on here. We'll take a look at these later, but I want to start with a blank canvas on my Visio. So I go to Edit in Visio, and I will make a new page here. I'll drag it to the front, so it's my first page. And I'll make a trend graph. So, like I said earlier, nothing is important here except for the bounding rectangle. So this is the size of the trend graph that we will show. Everything else is not important. If I make this orange and I make this a blue line, this won't be visible. So I need my shape data component set to trending. And then I also need parameter shape data. And I will just put a pipe to show an empty trend graph. I now go back to Cube. You can see here we have an empty trend graph. We can't really add onto it, but we'll see later that we can add an option to show the legend in there as well, and then you'll automatically be able to add parameters in there as well. So that's how you often use this. If I do want to define a certain parameter, I can do so, for instance, by just entering a parameter ID. Now in this case, I'm connected to a view, so I don't really have the context of an element. However, if you enter a parameter ID only, it will search for the context of your element. If you're on an element card, it will immediately take that context. But you can also, for instance, group this. And I can make this a part of a larger element shape that shows other info about the element, but also a trend graph, for instance. So I'll group this together and I'll make a parent shape with element shape data set to DMA info, which is a Microsoft platform element. It monitors our server. I'll save this. And what we see now is actually the total processor load, so the CPU usage of our server. Now, if I hover over this, I can see I get an action button here to open my card. But if I don't want that, I can take this grouped shape, quickly show you what the structure is right now. So we have a group shape here with the element DMA info, and below that we have a shape with our trend graph. I don't want to be able to click on the element shape itself. I want the trend graph to be interactive. So I'll put an enabled shape data on here and set it to false. Save this. And if I now take a look, you can see that my graph is interactive and I can zoom in and out. I can pan whichever way I like. If you do want to or need to define the element on the trend graph itself, you can do so in the parameter shape data by, for instance, defining the name of the element. And then, as we saw in the shape types PDF, you need to separate your element and your index with your parameter ID with a colon. So I will define this. You can also use the actual element key, by which I mean the ID of the element with its data miner ID. So I can find that in data miner cube. I want my DMA info and go to properties. You can find the ID right here. You can just copy and paste this. Go to your Visio and put it in the first part. This works. Putting a colon here instead also works, but it's something we don't really advertise anymore because this is a global notation for data miner and we try to use it as often as possible. If I save this and go back, you can see I have the same trend graph 3 times right now. Your parameter shape data can also hold dynamic parts, so I can enter something like this element, for instance, if I'm in an element context as a placeholder. I'm not in an element context now, so I won't really show this to you. But this is something you can do. Note that any dynamic part can be used in here, so you can use a parameter placeholder or a variable placeholder. The important thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you do this, you need to be aware that every time the shape data changes, a whole bunch of messages need to be sent to the server to retrieve all of the new data. So try to not change it too often because it will need to refresh your trend graph over and over and over again. The next thing I want to show is how to display cells from a table, so how to display the trending from that. For this, I can, for instance, I'll just keep this. And I'll take parameter ID 107, which is actually the CPU load for each process in my task manager table. And I want to see this for the SL protocol process. I don't know which exactly, so I just put an asterisk behind it, which will act as a wildcard to match with any process that starts with SL protocol. If I save this right now, and I go to my DMA, I can actually see I get multiple trend graphs stacked onto each other. You can see they all start with SL protocol. We have number 1, we have 0, number 2, etc. If I know exactly which one to show, I can just specify it here. What we'll see now is that this doesn't work. Why does it not work? Well, my key from my table actually contains a colon. This is something that can happen throughout Visio and various shape data where you need to separate on a certain character. So in this case, we want to separate on a colon to see where our element is, where our parameter ID is, and things like that. And that also means that it will separate here on this colon. So what I want to do is I want to use a different separator for my shape data. So I use the sep placeholder. So it's sep colon. Then you put in the colon that the separator that you want to replace. In this case, again, a colon. And what you have replaced it with. And I will replace it with this special character that is almost never used. And then I can put this where I want to actually separate my shape data. If I save this now, I can see I actually have the correct process. Important to know is that even though I haven't really entered a wildcard in this case, we will still try to match it as a wildcard, which means we have to send a message to the server to retrieve all indices from your table that match this exactly. If you know the exact key, you don't really want to send a server message for this, so you can just enter a parameters option. So we put in the parameters option shape data, and the option is called no wildcard. If I save this now, the result will be the exact same, but you won't lose time going back and forth to the server to retrieve whichever index matches with SL protocol :0. So that's a bit on how we can define different parameters. with indices or with just the parameter ID, with or without the element specified, depending on which context you have. But we can also show a trend graph. Let's take a look at our trending app. We have some trend graphs right here. For instance, the group DMA. And this is very simple. Instead of entering all of this, you can just enter your group name in here, although you need to be specific that it's a trend group. You need to enter the user that owns the trend group. In our case, we're talking about a shared group, so it's either a public or a protected group. In that case, the user will always be shared user settings. Then we put a colon and the group name, which is DMA. Save this. I need to go back to my components card. And we can see a trend group is loaded, and it contains info about our DMA, being the total amount of threads, the total processor load, and the physical memory usage at this point. So that's a couple of ways in which we can define our trend graphs or our initial parameters to show. If you want to freshen up on this, you can go to the data miner help and see all of the options here. If you look for the page linking a shape to a trend component, you will find this. And then you can take a look at some basic shape data configuration where you can see the different syntaxes we just covered. And then we have some parameters options and things like that. But of course, we'll take a look at that in a second.